Okay, let's dive into a decade that truly reshaped America, the 1960s. It was a time buzzing with change, conflict, and, well, some really bold new ideas. Ideas captured in phrases like the new frontier and the Great Society.
Absolutely, a period of intense transformation. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on understanding that era by looking closely at two presidencies, John F. Kennedy's and Lyndon B. Johnson's. We've pulled together, a stack of sources, notes, excerpts, research that really highlight their impact.
Impact on everything, right? Domestic policy, the Cold War.
And critically, the surging civil rights movement and other uh, seismic social shifts happening at the time.
So our mission, to take you on a journey through the key events, the major policies, and the powerful social movements outlined in these sources. We want to help you cut through the noise, understand the complexities, and, grasp the lasting impact of these turbulent years without getting too bogged down.
Exactly. We're here to act as your guides through this material, helping you find the most important nuggets of knowledge that make sense of a decade that felt like it was simultaneously, well, coming together and falling apart.
All right, let's set the stage then. Let's jump into the early years of that transformation, starting with the new frontier in John F. Kennedy's presidency. That's 61 to 63. And it all really kicks off with a pretty significant election, the one in 1960. What do our sources highlight about that contest?
Well, you had a fascinating matchup. On the Republican side, Vice President Richard Nixon. He was already, very well known, seen as Eisenhower's troubleshooter.
Right, the kitchen debate guy.
Exactly. Gained international fame from that debate with Khrushchev.
And for the Democrats, Senator John F. Kennedy. Young, charismatic, and he had Lyndon B. Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader, as his running mate. Kennedy talked about his vision as the new frontier. Our notes capture him describing it less as government promises and more like challenges.
Right? Challenges and opportunities. And he put that into a famous quote, didn't he? Something like, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s.
A frontier of unknown opportunities and paths. A frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats."
Yeah, and he specified, "The new frontier I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges." Powerful stuff.
It really framed his approach. But the campaign itself, it wasn't smooth sailing. Kennedy's Catholicism was a big deal initially. How did he handle that, according to our sources?
He addressed it head on, spoke to a group of Protestant ministers, basically said, "Look, I believe in separation of church and state. My faith won't dictate my actions as president."
And that seemed to work.
Our sources suggest it significantly diffused the issue for a lot of voters, yeah.
And then came those debates, the first presidential debates ever televised. That was huge.
It really was, and our research notes have a crucial insight here. People listening on the radio, they tended to think Nixon won.
But those watching on TV favored Kennedy. It just showed the rising power of the visual, didn't it? How you looked mattered. Absolutely pivotal moment. And Kennedy got another boost, especially with African-American voters, when he personally stepped in to help get Martin Luther King Jr. released from jail in Georgia.
That was a significant move.
So the election itself ends up being incredibly close, one of the closest ever, really. Kennedy wins the popular vote by just over 100,000, narrow margin in the Electoral College, too.
Making him the youngest elected president and the first Catholic. And the Democrats also swept Congress, giving them control.
And he followed that win with that inaugural address, the one everyone remembers. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
A really defining call to service.
So with all that energy, that mandate, what did Kennedy's new frontier actually look like domestically? Was he able to push his agenda through?
Well, our sources indicate he hit some major roadblocks pretty quickly. His big legislative plans, they ran into strong opposition.
From who?
Both Republicans and, importantly, conservative Southern Democrats in Congress. They formed a kind of coalition that blocked a lot of things.
Things like federal aid for education, urban renewal plans, medical care for the elderly, even tax cuts or a new Department of Urban Affairs.
Yeah, a lot of those key initiatives were basically stopped in their tracks. It's interesting, our notes point out that many of these exact ideas would pass later, under LBJ.
But he did get some things done, right? It wasn't total gridlock.
No, not entirely. There were successes. The minimum wage went up from $1 to $1.25, and more workers were covered.
Okay.
There's the Area Redevelopment Act in '61, about $400 million for struggling areas. And the Housing Act, that was $5 billion for things like urban preservation, transit, housing for the middle class.
And there's that interesting story in our sources about the steel industry, too, where he sort of pressured them.
Yeah, jawboning, they called it.
Yeah.
He basically leaned on the industry to roll back a price increase after he'd asked labor unions to hold back on wage demands, a direct use of presidential power.
Another big focus, though maybe more about the Cold War competition, was the space race. The U.S. felt behind the Soviets, didn't they?
They did. And Kennedy made this huge commitment, a $24 billion project, the goal. Land an American on the moon before the decade was out.
Incredibly ambitious. And they did it, eventually, Apollo 11 in '69. But our sources mentioned there was pushback at the time about the cost.
Oh, yeah. Critics asked if that money couldn't be better spent tackling problems here on Earth. A valid question.
And domestically, one more thing, his brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, he led a crackdown on organized crime.
Right, RFK took that on seriously.
Now let's pivot to civil rights under Kennedy. Our sources suggest his approach.
Well, it changed quite a bit during his presidency. Started out cautiously.
Yes, definitely in the first couple of years, you have to remember the political tightrope he was walking, trying to keep both white and black Southern voters, or at least not alienate them completely.
So early efforts were more symbolic.
Largely, yes. And RFK's attempts to boost black voter registration in the South, they faced huge hurdles. Literacy tests, poll taxes, outright violence and terror from white segregationists against groups like SNCC. Progress was painfully slow, but the pressure was building. You had activists, often using more confrontational tactics, really forcing the issue. The Freedom Riders in '61.
Organized by CORE, yeah.
Yeah.
Testing segregation on interstate buses. And they faced just brutal violence in Alabama. Arrests, beatings.
That forced the administration's hand, didn't it?
It did. RFK petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission, sent in federal marshals. The ICC eventually ruled against segregation on interstate travel later that year. That was a big win, achieved through that direct action.
Then things escalate further in September '62, James Meredith trying to enroll at Ole Miss.
And Kennedy had to send in the U.S. Army to enforce the court order. Our sources framed this as a moment where you can see the administration kind of losing control, the issue escalating beyond their initial, more cautious approach.
But the real flashpoint, maybe the biggest turning point, was Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. MLK targeted Birmingham specifically.
Yes, King chose Birmingham precisely because it was known for its rigid segregation. He believed if they could crack Birmingham, it would have national implications. They started demonstrations, marches,
And got arrested for marching without a permit, which led to King writing that incredible letter from a Birmingham jail.
so powerful. Our sources pull out key lines. King arguing that freedom isn't just given, it must be demanded by the oppressed, and pushing back against calls to wait.
Yeah, he says, for years now I have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. Just lays it out there.
And after King got out, the protests continued. And they started using new tactics, like involving school children in the marches. That's when things got really ugly.
The images. Police Commissioner Bull Connor, using cattle prods, attack dogs, fire hoses.
On children. And it was all broadcast, seen around the world.
That brutality, seen globally, must have created immense pressure.
It absolutely did. Public pressure mounted hugely. Eventually, local businesses in Birmingham agreed to desegregate facilities, and King called off the protests.
But it wasn't over. That same night, bombings hit King's Motel, his brother's home. Riots broke out.
And that seemed to be the final straw for Kennedy. He clearly sided with King after that. In June '63, he federalized the Alabama National Guard to force the University of Alabama to admit 2 black students.
Despite Governor George Wallace literally standing in the schoolhouse door, that famous image. And Wallace's whole segregation forever pledge.
Right. And then, just hours later, that night, Medgar Evers, the NAACP director in Mississippi, was assassinated, seen as direct retaliation.
Horrifying. And Kennedy's response.
He went on TV and announced he was sending a comprehensive civil rights bill to Congress. A bill to really crush segregation, outlaw voter discrimination, give the Justice Department power for school integration. A major shift.
This all leads up to the March on Washington in August '63, doesn't it?
It does. A massive event, partially organized by the veteran activist A. Philip Randolph. 200,000 people came, the largest protest in U.S. history up to that point.
Demanding support for Kennedy's bill, demanding jobs.
And, of course, it was where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech.
Just iconic. Our sources have some of the key lines. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident. that all men are created equal.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
And the ending. When we let freedom ring from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children will be able to join hands and sing, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Chills every time.
Truly unforgettable. And by the time Kennedy was assassinated just a few months later, that civil rights bill he proposed, it was already moving through the House.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Foreign policy. Kennedy faced intense Cold War pressure. Our sources talk about his strategy as flexible response. What was that about?
Well, it was moving away from Eisenhower's doctrine of massive retaliation. The idea that any Soviet aggression might trigger a full nuclear response. Kennedy wanted more options.
Like what?
Building up conventional military forces, creating units like the Green Berets, so the U.S. could respond to smaller conflicts, these wars of liberation. Khrushchev was backing and developing nations without immediately going nuclear.
It's interesting, though. He campaigned criticizing a supposed missile gap favoring the Soviets.
Right, but our sources say he learned after the election that the U.S. actually had the nuclear advantage, yet he still went ahead with a huge peacetime military buildup.
And one of the first major foreign policy tests was Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion, April '61.
Yeah, a real fiasco. It was a CIA plan cooked up under Eisenhower using Cuban exiles to try and overthrow Fidel Castro.
Kennedy inherited it and let it go forward, but then held back direct U.S. military support.
Exactly. He decided against direct intervention, fearing it could spark a much bigger international crisis. The result? A total failure. Over 1,100 exiles captured, hundreds killed, barely any rescued. And crucially, the Cuban people didn't rise up to support them.
Kennedy took public blame, but privately.
Privately, our sources say he blamed the CIA. And a big consequence was it pushed Cuba and the Soviet Union much closer together. The U.S. even continued secret plots, like Operation Mongoose, to try and get rid of Castro, though that stopped after the missile crisis.
But Kennedy also tried other approaches, right? Soft power.
He did. The Peace Corps, established in '61, was a huge success story, really popular, sending young American volunteers, doctors, teachers, engineers to developing countries.
An alternative to just military containment, build goodwill.
Exactly. By '66, there were 15,000 volunteers out there, though our notes mention they were often dealing with problems way bigger than they could solve alone. There was also the Alliance for Progress, kind of a Marshall Plan for Latin America, aimed at reducing poverty to counter communist influence.
Did it work?
Sources suggest it had pretty limited impact on the deep social problems there.
Meanwhile, tensions were boiling over in Europe, Berlin.
Yeah, East Germans were flooding into West Berlin. Khrushchev, maybe sensing weakness after the Bay of Pigs, issued an ultimatum demanding Western powers leave.
How did Kennedy respond?
Firmly. He said the U.S. wasn't leaving West Berlin. Both sides boosted military spending. And then, boom, August 1961, the Soviets literally built the Berlin Wall overnight to stop the flow of people.
A stark symbol. Kennedy called up reserves.
He did, and later visited West Berlin, gave that famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, declaring solidarity. Tensions eased slightly when a formal treaty wasn't signed, keeping access routes open, but that wall stayed up until 1989, a physical division of the Cold War. But the absolute peak of Cold War terror came in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Soviets secretly putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida.
Unbelievably dangerous. The goal, our sources suggest, was probably leverage. Force U.S. concessions on Berlin, maybe other issues. U.S. spy planes got photos, saw how fast they were being installed.
And it drastically cut down warning time for an attack on the U.S.
From about 30 minutes down to maybe 2. And a really chilling detail our sources highlight. The U.S. didn't even know at the time the Soviets also had tactical nukes and nuclear cruise missiles there.
Oh, wow. So what did Kennedy do? October 22nd.
He went public. Announced a naval quarantine, basically a blockade around Cuba. Demanded the Soviets remove the missiles. And he warned any attack launched from Cuba would mean full retaliation against the USSR itself.
What about military options? Bombing. Invading.
He rejected a surgical strike, fearing they wouldn't get all the missiles and it could trigger war. He also rejected an invasion which many military advisors wanted, largely because, unknown to them, those Soviet tactical nukes could have wiped out an invading force. That likely would have meant World War III.
So he announced the quarantine on TV, U.S. forces on high alert, the whole world held its breath.
For about a week, yeah. Soviet ships carrying more missiles were steaming towards the quarantine line. If they crossed, and the U.S. Navy tried to stop them, War seemed almost inevitable.
But the ships stopped.
They did on October 24th before reaching the line. Then a few days later, October 26th, a deal was struck. Khrushchev agreed, remove the missiles from Cuba.
In return,
The U.S. promised not to invade Cuba and, secretly, agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, which bordered the Soviet Union.
so publicly, it looked like a huge win for Kennedy. The Turkey missile removal was kept quiet for months.
Right. But our sources point out it was also a kind of victory for Khrushchev. He saved Cuba from invasion and got those U.S. missiles out of Turkey.
That close call, though, it led to some cooperation.
It did. A real sobering moment for both sides. They realized how close they'd come. This led to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in July '63, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space.
Not a complete ban. Underground tests were still allowed because Khrushchev wouldn't agree to on-site inspections. And it didn't reduce stockpiles.
True, and France and China didn't sign. But Kennedy saw it as his greatest achievement. They also set up the hotline, a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington for emergencies.
A necessary step, clearly. But then, tragically, Kennedy's presidency, his new frontier, came to an abrupt end. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas.
Assassinated while on a political trip, trying to shore up support in the South.
The alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, arrested quickly. But then Oswald himself was killed just days later.
By Jack Ruby, yeah. A nightclub owner with alleged ties to the mafia. Just added layers of conspiracy and confusion.
The official investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded Oswald acted alone, became known for that magic bullet theory, trying to explain the wounds.
And our sources note that conclusion has been questioned ever since. Questions about the bullet's path, Oswald's background and connections, issues with the autopsy, lots of lingering doubts.
And from that terrible national tragedy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson takes the oath of office, a moment of profound shock. He immediately pledges to carry on Kennedy's work, especially the domestic agenda, which brings us to LBJ's presidency, 63 to 69, and his vision for a great society.
Johnson was a master legislator. He knew Congress inside and out. He used that skill, plus the wave of national grief and desire for continuity, to push through those bills that had been stalled under Kennedy.
Like the Civil Rights Bill and the tax cut bill?
Exactly. Rammed them through. And he immediately declared a war on poverty, getting legislation passed that allocated billions to address poverty in America. That 1964 tax cut, our sources say, also helped spark a major economic boom.
Then came the 1964 election. Johnson running on his own platform now, the Great Society. How did he describe that?
He pitched it as a massive, sweeping effort to transform American society, really on the scale of FDR's New Deal. It was heavily influenced by books like Michael Harrington's The Other America, which had exposed the shocking extent of poverty affecting maybe 20% of Americans and over 40% of Black Americans.
And his opponent was Senator Barry Goldwater from Arizona. A very different vision.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Goldwater attacked core federal programs, income tax, Social Security, the TVA. He criticized the Civil Rights Act, the nuclear test ban, the whole Great Society concept.
He's often called the father of modern conservatism, right? Our notes even compare his 64 platform to Reagan's in 1980.
That's right. The campaign got pretty heated. Johnson portrayed himself as the experienced statesman. He used the Gulf of Tonkin incident to suggest he was handling Vietnam cautiously. And he painted Goldwater as, well, a warmonger, someone who might use tactical nukes.
Even many Republicans thought Goldwater was too extreme.
The result was a massive landslide for Johnson. Huge electoral win, over 60% of the popular vote. And Democrats swept Congress with big majorities. This gave LBJ a powerful mandate to build his great society.
And build he did. It was an explosion of legislation after that election. The war on poverty expanded hugely. The Office of Economic Opportunity got a big budget boost.
You had major initiatives like funding for redevelopment in poor regions like Appalachia, billions for elementary and secondary education, and Head Start that program to prepare disadvantaged preschoolers for school.
Plus, a landmark achievement in healthcare. Medicare passed in 1965. Health insurance for the elderly. Our sources note millions have been pushed to poverty by medical bills before that.
Huge. And for cities, a whole new cabinet department, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, created in '66, focused on housing aid, urban renewal.
And its first secretary was Robert C. Weaver, the first African-American cabinet member.
A historic appointment. Immigration law also got a major overhaul with the Immigration Act of 1965.
That's the one that got rid of the old quota system based on national origin from the 1920s.
Yes, replaced it with priorities like family reunification, needed job skills, political asylum. Our sources really stress the impact here. It more than doubled the number of immigrants allowed each year, and the main sources shifted from Europe to Asia and Latin America. A fundamental change.
The Great Society also touched consumer protection, arts funding,
Yeah, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, PBS.
environmental protection too, like the Water Quality Act. And of course, Johnson kept the space program going, leading to the moon landing win.
But, arguably the most profound legacy of the Great Society, and something Johnson was deeply committed to, was civil rights. The legal changes were truly transformative.
Starting with the 24th Amendment in early '64, banning the poll tax in federal elections. Then the big one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson, a Southerner himself, got Kennedy's bill passed.
And it was incredibly comprehensive. Banned segregation in public places involved in interstate commerce, hotels, restaurants, you name it. Created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC.
Yeah.
Gave the federal government power to sue over discrimination. Got rid of remaining barriers to black voting.
And Title VII that outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. That was huge.
Absolutely. And the impact, according to our sources, was pretty immediate. Most businesses in southern cities and towns actually desegregated fairly quickly after it passed.
But the fight wasn't over, particularly for voting rights. Even with the '64 Act, states found ways to keep black people off the rolls, especially in the Deep South.
Exactly, which led directly to the push for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The focus really zeroed in on Selma, Alabama, a place where only about 383 black residents out of 15,000 eligible were actually registered to vote.
Just appalling numbers. And the marches from Selma to Montgomery became the focal point.
The first attempt, March 7th, ended in horrific violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. State troopers attacked the peaceful marchers. It became known as Bloody Sunday.
Images went everywhere. King led a second march a few days later, but turned back at the bridge.
Right, a tense standoff. They knelt and prayed, saying, "We shall overcome," then retreated. But the pressure was immense.
And Johnson responded, went on national TV March 15th, promised a strong voting rights bill, said, "We shall overcome." Powerful moment.
It was. And on March 21st, the march finally went ahead, protected by federalized National Guard troops all the way to Montgomery.
And the Voting Rights Act followed quickly. What did it do specifically?
It gave the law teeth. It banned literacy tests in places where less than half the voting age population was registered, essentially targeting those southern states. African Americans could register even if they couldn't pass some arbitrary reading test.
And it allowed federal officials to go in.
Yes, the president could send federal examiners to register voters directly if local officials refused. It basically bypassed the local resistance.
The impact must have been huge.
Dramatic. Yeah. Our sources say 740,000 African Americans registered in the South within 3 years. Hundreds of black officials got elected. The fear of white retaliation lessened. Southern politicians actually started courting black votes.
And it even reversed migration patterns. Black people started moving back to the South.
For the first time since Reconstruction, yes. A profound shift.
Another Great Society element was affirmative action. How did that start?
Johnson issued an executive order in 1965. It required businesses with federal contracts to take affirmative action to ensure they hired underprivileged minorities and women.
Nixon expanded it later.
He did. It spread to corporations, colleges, universities getting federal money. The goal was to actively increase representation. And it worked to an extent. You saw a big jump in Black, Asian, Hispanic enrollment in universities.
But it wasn't without controversy. Reverse discrimination became the pushback.
Especially in the 70s, yeah. As the economy slowed down, competition for jobs and college spots heated up. Critics argued these programs unfairly disadvantaged white men.
That led to the Bake Supreme Court case in '78.
Right. Alan Bake, a white applicant, argued he was unfairly denied admission to medical school because of a program setting aside spots for minorities. The court issued a complex ruling.
What did they decide?
They said Bake was unfairly denied. Race or ethnicity could be considered as one factor among others in admissions, but setting aside a specific quota based only on race was illegal. Affirmative action continued, championed by figures like Jesse Jackson, but it faced legal challenges and was weakened by later court decisions.
Beyond legislation, Johnson also made that historic Supreme Court appointment in '67.
Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American justice, hugely significant.
And the courts kept pushing on segregation. In '68, the Supreme Court addressed de facto segregation that existed in practice, even without specific laws.
Right. They ordered school districts to actively integrate, even if it meant bussing kids out of their neighborhoods to achieve racial balance in schools.
That became incredibly controversial, didn't it? Especially with white families in the suburbs later on.
Hugely controversial for decades.
So looking back at that whole period, say 54 with Brown up to 68, our sources call it the Second Reconstruction.
Yeah, a period where legal equality, on paper at least, was largely achieved. And the strategies of the Black Civil Rights Movement, they became a blueprint for other groups fighting for their rights.
But it's important, our sources stress, that not everyone in the Black community agreed with King's nonviolent integrationist approach, especially as the 60s wore on.
Definitely not. You saw the rise of Black separatism. The idea wasn't integration, but separation may be a return to Africa or creating a separate Black nation within the U.S. Echoes of Marcus Garvey. The Nation of Islam was the most visible group pushing this.
And Malcolm X became their most powerful spokesman. Very different message from King.
Very different. He talked about Black pride, self-reliance, and achieving rights by any means necessary. He advocated armed self-defense, which alarmed many whites who embraced King's nonviolence.
Our sources mention his views moderated a bit after his pilgrimage to Mecca. He left the Nation of Islam.
He did. But then, tragically, he was assassinated in February 65 by members of the Nation of Islam. There's that striking quote our notes include, where Malcolm X said something like, "The white people should thank Dr. King for holding Black people in check." Gives you a sense of the different pressures.
And this shift was felt in established groups too, like SNCC and CORE.
Yeah, they started moving towards Black nationalism, calling for movements to be Black-led, Black-funded, rejecting interracial cooperation in some cases. Integration wasn't the only goal anymore.
Stokely Carmichael comes into this picture. Black power.
Yes, influenced by Malcolm X. Carmichael popularized the phrase Black power, which meant different things: political control, economic self-sufficiency, cultural pride. He later joined the Black Panthers.
Founded in Oakland by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they were more like urban revolutionaries.
Definitely. Organized for Black liberation, self-defense, sometimes clashing violently with police.
And alongside these ideological shifts, you had this explosion of actual racial violence in cities. The long, hot summers.
Yeah, 65, 66, 67, riots hit major cities across the country. Our sources link it to the deep-seated problems in inner cities: poverty, unemployment, ongoing discrimination, a sense that the promise of equality, especially in the North, felt empty.
Watts in LA, 65. Detroit in 67. The scale was massive.
Watts saw dozens killed, huge property loss. Detroit was intense mass arrests, white businesses targeted, snipers attacking firefighters. Our notes say over 150 cities had incidents just in the first 9 months of 67. It was nationwide.
Johnson set up the Kerner Commission to figure out why this was happening. What did they find?
Their conclusions were pretty stark, according to our sources. They blamed frustrated hopes, a sense of powerlessness in Black communities, but they also pointed fingers at both white terrorism and the rhetoric of some Black protest groups for encouraging violence.
What did they recommend?
Major societal changes. Eliminate barriers in jobs, education, housing, more public response to minority problems, better communication across racial lines. Basically, tackle the root causes.
And then, amidst all this turmoil, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in Memphis.
A devastating blow. He was there supporting striking sanitation workers. Our sources note he'd actually lost some support because of his stance against the Vietnam War, and he was trying to rebuild momentum for his Poor People's Campaign.
That final speech he gave the night before, "I've been to the mountaintop."
We, as a people, will get to the promised land. Almost like he knew. His death marked the end of an era for the nonviolent movement.
Beyond politics and civil rights, the 60s were just a time of huge social and cultural ferment. The baby boomers coming of age played a big role.
A massive role. The number of college students just exploded. 4 million by the mid-60s, compared to maybe 1 million in 1950. Mostly from fairly comfortable backgrounds.
Though our notes add an important point. The really active student protesters, that was actually a minority, maybe 10–15% of students overall, but they were highly visible.
Right. You had the rise of the New Left. Broadly, that described a lot of people under 30 by mid-decade. But the movement part often focused on universities, seeing them as these big impersonal bureaucracies.
Groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, led by Tom Hayden.
Yeah, they called for participatory democracy, wanting students to have more say. The free speech movement at Berkeley in '64 is a key example. Started over rules about political activity on campus, but grew into a critique of American society in general.
Police broke up a sit-in, protests spread.
And as the Vietnam War escalated, SDS and other groups became much more militant in their opposition.
And alongside the political protests, there was a whole counterculture movement. Young people rejecting mainstream values, experimenting with lifestyles.
Absolutely. Expressed through fashion, alternative living, and especially music. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger providing anthems. Even the Beatles were tapping into and influenced by the U.S. counterculture.
Woodstock in '69 becomes the iconic symbol, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin.
The defining event for many, a cultural moment.
Another huge force shaping the decade, legally and socially, was the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren.
Appointed by Eisenhower back in '53. The Warren Court years are seen as one of the most transformative periods in Supreme Court history, right up there with John Marshall's era.
Their focus was really on individual rights, especially the First Amendment.
Yes, giving personal rights a kind of preferred constitutional position. And obviously their landmark ruling was Brown v. Board of Education in '54, outlawing school segregation. That set the stage for so much.
They also tackled voting rights with reapportionment, the one person, one vote idea.
Right. Those decisions forced states to redraw legislative districts based on population, shifting power away from rural areas towards the growing cities and suburbs.
And they significantly expanded the rights of people accused of crimes. Cases like Gideon
V. Wainwright in '63. Guaranteed a lawyer if you can't afford one. Escobedo v. Illinois in '64. Right to have a lawyer present during questioning.
And the big one, Miranda.
Miranda v. Arizona, '66. That's the one requiring police to inform suspects of their rights, right to remain silent, right to an attorney. The Miranda rights we hear all the time. The Warren Court also banned mandatory prayer and religious exercises in public schools back in '62. Very controversial decisions at the time.
So building on all these currents, civil rights, student activism, the focus on individual rights, you also see the women's rights movement gaining new energy in the '60s.
Definitely. There was groundwork laid earlier, like Eleanor Roosevelt's Commission on the Status of Women, which highlighted inequalities. But a key catalyst was Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963.
What was its main argument?
It criticized the cult of domesticity, the idea that women found fulfillment only as wives and mothers. Friedan spoke to the dissatisfaction of many educated women stuck in domestic roles, and also pointed out that women who did work often faced lower pay and fewer opportunities.
And she helped found NW, the National Organization for Women, in '66.
Yes, with other feminists. NW pushed for things like equal pay, equal job opportunities, fair divorce laws, and, most controversially, the legalization of abortion.
They also picked up the fight for an Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA.
They did. Starting around '67, that idea had been around since Alice Paul proposed it in the '20s. The ERA actually passed Congress in 1972.
But it failed ratification by the states, right? Why, according to our sources?
Several factors. Some felt the movement focused too much on middle-class white women's issues. And there was strong opposition, led by figures like Phyllis Schlafly. They argued the ERA would destroy traditional family structures, maybe end alimony or protective labor laws for women. The pro-life movement also heavily opposed it. It fell short of the needed state ratifications by the deadline in the early '80s.
But even without the ERA, the movement made huge strides, often using the tools created by the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. In '72, the federal government required colleges getting federal funds to use affirmative action for women. Title IX guaranteed girls equal access to educational programs, including sports that had a massive impact.
Roe v. Wade in '73 legalized abortion nationwide.
A landmark Supreme Court decision taking it out of state control. Corporations were forced, often through lawsuits using Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act, to address pay gaps and discriminatory hiring. Women gained more roles in the military, too.
And you started seeing female trailblazers. Sally Ride in space, Geraldine Ferraro on the presidential ticket in '84.
Visible signs of change. And it wasn't just African Americans and women. Other minority groups were organizing, too, using similar strategies.
Like Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Cesar Chavez, and the farm workers.
Yes, Chavez led the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, UFWOC, fighting for better conditions for mostly Chicano agricultural laborers. You also had political groups like La Raza Unida trying to build voting power in cities. Our sources note this led to more Mexican Americans getting elected later on.
Native Americans also became more visible, more militant.
The American Indian Movement, AAM, founded in '68, they used direct action, seizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs in D.C. in '72 to protest reservation conditions, like high unemployment and poor education.
And the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in '73.
That lasted 2 months, gained huge national attention. There were casualties, arrests, but it highlighted their grievances. Our sources say these actions led to some concrete wins, regaining lost fishing rights, getting millions in compensation for lands taken illegally decades before.
And our notes briefly mention the start of the gay rights movement, also drawing on civil rights law later to fight discrimination.
Right, that movement really emerged more fully in the following decade.
Right.
But the seeds were sown here.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground. Kennedy's New Frontier, Johnson's Great Society, the massive shifts in civil rights, the counterculture, the courts, women's rights, other minority movements. Looking back at this whole turbulent decade, especially through the lens of LBJ's presidency, what's the overall legacy? What do our sources suggest?
Well, Johnson's legacy is definitely complex, as our sources describe it. On one side, you have this incredible compassion. They argue no president since Lincoln did more for the poor, the marginalized, for civil rights.
Yeah.
His legislative achievements in just those first 3 years, comparable to the entire New Deal.
And there were results. The Great Society programs worked.
The data shows poverty rates did fall significantly. Medicare really helped reduce poverty among the elderly. Head Start demonstrably improved education for underprivileged kids. Infant mortality dropped in minority communities. There were tangible successes.
But there was also major criticism, right? Especially from conservatives.
Oh, yeah. They saw the programs as incredibly expensive, requiring tax hikes. They called it social engineering, arguing government spending couldn't solve these deep-rooted social problems on its own.
And then there's the giant shadow looming over everything, Vietnam.
Exactly. Our sources are clear. The Vietnam War fundamentally undermined the Great Society. It siphoned off money, energy, political capital. It fueled inflation that hurt the domestic programs. Many argue the war on poverty was ultimately lost because of the war in Vietnam.
And Johnson's handling of Vietnam created so much of the decade's turbulence, the protests, the division.
And led to a deep, lasting skepticism towards government among many Americans.
So pulling all this material together, the soaring ambitions of the New Frontier and Great Society, the landmark victories in civil rights, the fierce pushback, the violence, the cultural earthquakes, it paints a picture of a decade just under immense pressure, driving incredible progress, but also deep, deep conflict.
It really does. Our sources lay out these undeniable gains: Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Head Start, the Warren court rulings. But they sit right alongside persistent racial violence, the rise of separatist movements, and the fact that even these ambitious government programs faced serious challenges and were ultimately curtailed, partly, maybe largely, due to Vietnam.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive into the 1960s, what moments, what policies, what struggles really stand out? How do these challenges, these transformations from over half a century ago, maybe resonate with things you see today?
And here's a final thought, drawing just from the material we've discussed. Considering the ambitious goals set forth a New Frontier, a Great Society, and the truly significant legislative victories achieved, especially around civil rights and poverty, what does the fact that these victories existed alongside continued racial violence, deep societal divisions, and the eventual struggling or curtailment of programs like the War on Poverty tell us about the fundamental, maybe enduring difficulty of achieving deep, lasting societal change in America?